Still unemployed at your age? Brandon asked loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. That's actually impressive. The laughter came fast. Warm. Comfortable. The kind of laughter people share when they think someone else is the joke. I remember looking down at the cup of tea in my hands and thinking that some mistakes take years to reveal themselves. Others announce themselves in a single sentence. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 67 years old, and the evening that was supposed to celebrate my sister's 70th birthday became the night one man unknowingly changed the course of his own reputation. The restaurant was one of those upscale places overlooking the waterfront outside Boston. All polished wood, soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor. My sister Linda had reserved the private dining room months earlier. She loved gatherings. She loved attention. And most of all, she loved surrounding herself with people who made her feel important. I arrived 10 minutes early carrying a small gift bag and wearing a navy blue dress I had owned for years. Nothing flashy. Nothing expensive looking. That had become my preference lately. Quiet things suited me. Quiet clothes. Quiet mornings. Quiet conversations. The room slowly filled with relatives, neighbors, old friends, and business acquaintances Linda had collected throughout the years. Then Brandon arrived. Brandon Hayes, 38 years old. Perfect haircut, designer watch, expensive shoes. The kind of man who entered every room as though it had been built specifically for him. He had been dating Linda for about a year. Some people found him charming. Others found him exhausting. I belonged firmly in the second category. Evelyn, he said as he approached my chair. Good to see you. You too, Brandon, I replied. He glanced at my simple outfit before taking his seat. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Men like Brandon rarely needed words to express what they thought of someone. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates of grilled salmon, filet mignon, and roasted vegetables. Wine glasses clinked. Stories were shared. Old memories resurfaced. For a while, I thought perhaps the evening would pass without incident. Then someone asked a harmless question. So Evelyn, one of Linda's friends said, smiling politely, what have you been keeping busy with these days? Before I could answer, Brandon leaned back in his chair. That's easy, he said. Nothing. She's unemployed. Several people laughed. Not cruelly at first. More out of surprise. Brandon grinned, encouraged by the reaction. I mean, seriously, he continued. Retirement sounds great. Sleeping in. No deadlines. No meetings. No responsibilities. Must be nice. More laughter followed. I noticed Linda smiling into her wine glass. Not stopping him. Not correcting him. Just enjoying the moment. I took a small sip of tea. Calmly. Slowly. Brandon pointed toward me as if presenting evidence. Honestly, she's got it figured out. The rest of us are working 60-hour weeks while Evelyn here has mastered the art of doing absolutely nothing. The room erupted again. I smiled politely. Nothing more. People often assume silence means weakness. They mistake restraint for surrender. They confuse dignity with defeat. I had learned long ago not to interrupt someone while they were revealing who they truly were. Across the table, a few guests shifted uncomfortably. One woman avoided eye contact. Another stared down at her plate. They could sense something was wrong. Not because of me, because of him. But Brandon didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying his audience. Actually, he said, raising his glass, let's make a toast to Evelyn. The only person here smart enough to avoid employment entirely. More laughter. Louder this time. I watched the harbor lights reflecting across the dark water outside the windows. Beautiful. Steady. Unbothered. Then I looked back at Brandon. He was smiling proudly, convinced he had become the center of the evening. What he didn't realize was that every word he spoke was building a stage beneath his own feet. And very soon, everyone in that room would have a front row seat to watch it collapse. I have noticed something about gatherings over the years. The loudest person in the room usually believes they are winning. Brandon certainly did. After his toast, Conversation drifted back toward Linda's birthday, but the energy had changed. People smiled when he spoke, yet some of those smiles looked forced now. A few guests exchanged glances when they thought nobody was watching. They had laughed with him moments earlier, but laughter has a short memory when discomfort begins to settle in. Brandon, however, seemed determined to keep the spotlight. He launched into another story about a recent investment, describing market trends with the confidence of a television commentator. Numbers flew across the table. Percentages, predictions, forecasts. He spoke as if success itself had personally appointed him as its spokesman. I listened quietly. Across from me, Linda appeared fascinated. She always admired people who projected certainty. It did not matter whether they were right. Confidence alone impressed her. I used to find that frustrating. Now I simply found it predictable. A waiter arrived carrying dessert menus. As people flipped through the pages, Brandon leaned back in his chair and adjusted the cuff of his expensive jacket. "The problem," he announced, "is that most people never learn how money works." Several heads nodded. They work their whole lives and still end up depending on someone else. His eyes drifted toward me for a fraction of a second. Just long enough. Just obvious enough. The message landed exactly where he intended. Nobody said anything. I traced a finger along the edge of my teacup. The porcelain felt cool, steady, familiar. Years ago, remarks like that would have bothered me. Years ago, I might have felt compelled to defend myself, explain myself, justify my choices. Age changes many things. One of them is realizing that explanations are often wasted on people who have already decided what they believe. Brandon believed he understood me. He believed he had all the facts. That confidence was about to become expensive. "What about you, Brandon?" someone asked. "What is your biggest investment these days?" His face brightened immediately. The question was an invitation back onto his favorite stage. "Technology," he said. "Artificial intelligence. Infrastructure. Logistics. That is where the future is." He began listing companies. Some were public. Some were private. Some were well-known. Others were not. What interested me was not what he said. It was what he did not know. Several of the businesses he proudly discussed had one thing in common. He had absolutely no idea that I owned substantial positions in them. Listening to him felt like watching a tourist explain a city to someone who had lived there for decades. Not insulting. Almost amusing. Almost. The harbor lights shimmered beyond the windows as darkness settled over the water. Boats moved slowly in the distance. Their reflections stretched across the surface like ribbons of gold. I found myself paying more attention to the view than to the conversation. Then a familiar name reached my ears. Brandon mentioned a company that had recently expanded into several states. "Brilliant leadership," he said. "I would love to meet the people behind that operation." I nearly smiled. I knew those people very well. Years earlier, I had been one of the earliest investors. I still received quarterly reports. I still spoke with leadership occasionally. Yet Brandon continued speaking as though the entire business world existed behind a curtain forever closed to someone like me. The irony would have been entertaining if it were not so revealing. As dessert arrived, a chocolate cake decorated with 70 candles arranged in the shape of a 7 and a 0, I noticed movement near the entrance to the private dining room. The hostess stepped aside. Someone had just arrived. First, nobody paid attention. Then I recognized the man walking through the doorway. And the moment I saw him, I knew the evening was about to take a direction Brandon could never have anticipated. The man who entered the room looked nothing like the people who usually tried to impress others. He was in his early 60s, wearing a simple charcoal suit and a light blue tie. No flashy watch. No dramatic entrance. Yet within seconds, several guests recognized him. Conversations softened. Chairs shifted. Attention moved. His name was Richard Bennett, and in certain business circles that name carried weight. Real weight. The kind that never needed to announce itself. Richard paused near the doorway and scanned the room. Then his face brightened. Not at Linda. Not at Brandon. At me. He walked directly across the dining room while several people watched in confusion. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "I was hoping you would be here." Before I could respond, he extended both hands and greeted me like an old friend. "It has been too long." I stood and returned his smile. "It has, Richard." Around us, silence settled over the table. Brandon looked puzzled. Linda looked surprised. Richard pulled out the empty chair beside me. "Do you mind if I sit for a few minutes?" he asked. "Of course not." The hostess quickly arranged an extra place setting while guests exchanged curious glances. Richard thanked her and settled into the chair. The birthday celebration had suddenly become something else entirely. "I heard you were traveling," I said. "I was," he replied. 3 states in 6 days. I am getting too old for that schedule." A few people laughed politely. Then Richard looked around the table. "I hope nobody minds me stealing Evelyn for a moment. I owe much of my success to her." A fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth. Across from me, Brandon blinked. "To Evelyn?" he asked. Richard nodded immediately. "Absolutely." His answer came so naturally that it seemed strange anyone would question it. Most people only see the finished story. They do not see the beginning. Nobody spoke. Richard continued. 20 years ago, I had an idea, a tiny office, and more optimism than experience. Banks were not interested. Investors were not interested. Most people thought I was wasting my time. He smiled toward me. "Except Evelyn." The room remained completely still. "She listened," he said. "She asked better questions than anyone else. Then she did something I never forgot. She believed in me when belief was expensive." I felt several pairs of eyes turn toward me. Brandon shifted in his chair. "You invested?" he asked. Richard laughed softly. "Invested?" She practically kept the lights on during our first year. More silence. Richard was not exaggerating. But hearing the story from him carried a different effect. "Without her," he continued, "there is a very good chance my company never survives those early years." Linda stared at me as though she were seeing a stranger. "You never told me that," she said. "You never asked," I replied gently. Richard smiled at that. "That sounds exactly like Evelyn." Dessert sat untouched on many plates now. Nobody seemed interested in cake anymore. The room had become focused on a story nobody expected to hear. Brandon attempted a smile. "Well, everybody has a lucky investment once in a while." Richard turned toward him politely. "Actually, she had more than one." The smile disappeared from Brandon's face. Richard continued speaking in the calm, measured voice of someone describing simple facts. "Several of the companies people discuss today exist because Evelyn saw opportunities long before the rest of us did." Then he looked directly at me. "I still tell young entrepreneurs to study your approach." For the first time that evening, Brandon had nothing to say. He looked down at his water glass, then back at Richard, then at me. The confidence that had filled every sentence earlier seemed to be slipping away. Slowly, quietly, like air escaping from a balloon. And the evening was only beginning to reveal its surprises. The atmosphere around the table felt different now. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the shift was there. I could see it in the way people looked at me when they thought I was not paying attention. Earlier, those looks had carried amusement or indifference. Now they carried curiosity. There is a difference. Curiosity asks questions. Indifference never bothers. Richard accepted a cup of coffee from a waiter and thanked him before turning back toward the group. "You know," he said, "one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming they can identify success just by looking at someone." A few guests nodded. Brandon remained quiet. That alone felt unusual. Throughout the evening he had treated every pause as an invitation to speak. Now he seemed content to let someone else hold the room. Richard continued. "The most successful people I have known rarely advertise it." His eyes moved briefly toward me. "Some of them drive ordinary cars. Some live in ordinary homes. Some never mention their accomplishments at all." Linda folded her hands together. "Evelyn has always been private," she said. "Very private," Richard agreed. Sometimes frustratingly private. A few people laughed softly. This time the laughter felt different. Gentler. Warmer. Nobody was laughing at anyone. They were simply listening. I glanced toward the harbor again. The water was almost black now, interrupted only by scattered reflections from distant lights. It reminded me of something my late husband used to say. He believed calm water often hid the greatest depth. He was usually right. So what happened? One of Linda's friends asked Richard. After those early investments? Richard smiled. She kept doing what she always does. She listened more than she talked. He pointed lightly toward me. Most people become excited by trends. Evelyn became interested in people. The question seemed to surprise several guests. They expected stories about money, numbers, wealth. Instead, Richard described conversations. Long meetings, careful evaluations, years of patience. The room listened closely. Brandon finally cleared his throat. Well, he said, forcing a casual tone. Timing is everything in investing. Richard nodded. Timing matters. Then he paused. Judgment matters more. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Brandon offered a tight smile. The kind people wear when they are trying to remain confident, while uncertainty begins creeping into the edges of their thoughts. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The truth was that Brandon had spent the entire evening building an image of himself. Every story, every comment, every boast. He wanted admiration. He wanted people to believe he understood success better than everyone else. What he never considered was that genuine accomplishment does not need constant validation. It survives perfectly well without applause. One of the younger guests leaned forward. Evelyn, why did you stop working? The question was sincere. No mockery. No hidden edge. I smiled. I did not stop working, I said. I simply stopped reporting to someone else's schedule. Several people chuckled. Richard laughed openly. That sounds exactly like something she would say. The young guest smiled. That is actually a great answer. Across the table, Linda looked thoughtful. I could almost see old assumptions being rearranged inside her mind. People often create stories about those closest to them. Stories based on fragments, habits, appearances. Then one day they discover entire chapters they never knew existed. Richard checked his watch and sighed. I cannot stay much longer. Early flight tomorrow. A few disappointed murmurs followed. He thanked Linda for allowing him to join the celebration. Then he stood. Before leaving, he rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. We still need to discuss that proposal, he said. The board would love your perspective. Several faces immediately turned toward me, including Brandon's. Richard smiled. Call me next week. I will, I said. He nodded and headed toward the door. As it closed behind him, the room remained unusually quiet. And for the first time that evening, every eye at the table seemed to be focused on the person Brandon had spent hours dismissing. The moment Richard left, the room seemed smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. His presence had filled the space with a kind of quiet authority, and now everyone was trying to make sense of what they had just learned. Nobody reached for dessert. Nobody seemed interested in continuing the conversations they had been having before. Instead, they looked at me, some openly, some discreetly. It was remarkable how quickly assumptions could change. An hour earlier, I had been little more than background decoration. Now I had become a mystery. Linda was the first to speak. Why did you never tell me any of this? She asked. Her voice was not angry. It was confused. I folded my hands together and considered the question. Because you never seemed interested, I said gently. The answer was simple, honest, and apparently difficult for her to hear. Linda blinked several times. I am your sister. You are, I agreed. But most people only ask questions when they truly want answers. Nobody interrupted. The words settled over the table quietly. Across from me, Brandon shifted in his chair again. He had been doing that a lot lately. Earlier, he had occupied every conversation with complete confidence. Now he seemed unable to find a comfortable position. Well, he finally said, forcing a laugh. I guess we all have hidden talents. The comment landed awkwardly. Nobody laughed. The silence that followed felt longer than it probably was. Brandon looked around, waiting for support that never arrived. I almost felt embarrassed for him. Almost. It was never about talent, I said. It was about patience. He nodded as though he understood, but I could tell he did not. Patience is difficult to explain to people who spend their lives chasing immediate recognition. One of Linda's friends leaned forward. Were you really involved with all those companies Richard mentioned? I smiled slightly. Some of them. Some? Another guest repeated. How many is some? I took a sip of tea before answering. Enough to keep me busy. That earned a few genuine laughs. Warm laughs. Not the kind that seek a victim. The kind that invite someone into the conversation. The difference mattered. Brandon stared at the tablecloth. I noticed something interesting then. Earlier, he had spoken constantly about himself. His investments. His strategies. His accomplishments. Now nobody was asking him questions. Nobody seemed interested. Attention had moved elsewhere. Not because I demanded it. Not because I wanted it. Simply because truth has a way of attracting interest once it appears. So what do you do all day? A younger guest asked. Whatever I want, I answered. More laughter followed. That sounds wonderful. Some days it is, I admitted. Other days I spend 6 hours reviewing reports. Several people looked surprised. 6 hours. Sometimes more. Brandon looked up. You still review reports? There was genuine confusion in his voice. Of course, I replied. Why would I stop? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The image he had created of me no longer fit the facts sitting in front of him. That can be an uncomfortable experience. Human beings tend to prefer simple stories. Successful, unsuccessful, important, unimportant, working, retired. But real life rarely fits into neat categories. The waiter returned to refill water glasses. As he moved away, Linda studied me carefully. You really have been doing all this for years? She asked. Yes. And you never said anything. No, she shook her head slowly. I do not understand that. I smiled. That is because we value different things. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the guests glanced toward Brandon and asked an innocent question. What companies were you talking about earlier? Brandon named several of them. The guest turned back toward me. Are those some of the ones you are involved with? I held his gaze for a second. Then I nodded. Most of them. And just like that, the silence returned. Nobody spoke for several seconds after I answered. Most of them were not looking at me anymore. They were looking at Brandon. Human nature is interesting that way. People rarely notice confidence until it begins to crack. Earlier that evening, Brandon had spoken about those companies, as though he understood them better than anyone else in the room. Now he was discovering that the woman he had dismissed knew far more than he did. The difference was that I had never felt the need to announce it. Most of them? One guest repeated. You are involved with most of them? I nodded. In different ways. The guest looked genuinely astonished. That is incredible. I smiled politely. It is mostly paperwork. That earned another round of laughter. Real laughter this time. Comfortable laughter. The kind that comes from shared enjoyment instead of shared ridicule. Brandon attempted to recover. Well, ownership and understanding are not always the same thing. His voice sounded steadier now. More confident. As though he had found solid ground again. I admired the effort. Unfortunately, effort and accuracy are not the same thing either. That is true, I said. Very true. He seemed relieved that I agreed. Then he leaned forward. The market is changing quickly. A lot of investors are making mistakes right now. Several guests looked toward him again. He was trying to reclaim the room, trying to return to familiar territory. That happens every cycle, I replied. Fear tends to make people impatient. He nodded immediately. Exactly. Then he launched into a detailed explanation of why certain sectors would outperform others over the next few years. Some of what he said was reasonable. Some of it was speculation dressed up as certainty. I listened carefully, not because I needed the information, because I wanted to understand him. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think they are teaching others. After several minutes, Brandon finished his analysis and leaned back with obvious satisfaction. A few guests nodded politely. Then someone turned toward me. "Do you agree?" The question hung in the air. Brandon watched me closely. So did everyone else. I considered my answer. "Parts of it," I said. His smile faded slightly. "Only parts." I kept my tone calm. Markets are complicated. Confidence can be useful. Overconfidence can be expensive. Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. The point landed on its own. Brandon stared at me for a moment before looking away. Linda cleared her throat. "I feel like I am learning more about my sister tonight than I have in years." "That makes two of us," one guest joked. More laughter followed. Linda smiled, but there was something thoughtful behind it now. Something almost regretful. I suspected she was remembering dozens of family gatherings where nobody had bothered asking me meaningful questions. It is easy to overlook people when you think you already know their story. The waiter began clearing dessert plates. Outside the windows, the harbor lights continued shimmering across the water. The birthday celebration had drifted far from its original course, yet nobody seemed eager to leave. Curiosity had taken hold of the room. Then a younger businessman seated near the end of the table spoke up. "Can I ask something?" "Of course," I said. "If you have been successful for so long, why live so quietly?" Several people nodded. It was the question everyone wanted answered. I looked around the table before responding. Because attention and happiness are not the same thing. The room grew still again. "I spent years watching people chase recognition," I continued. "Most of them never felt they had enough. There was always another promotion, another house, another title, another audience." I smiled softly. Eventually I realized I preferred peace. Nobody interrupted. Nobody checked their phones. Even Brandon remained silent. And for the first time that evening, I could see something changing in the room. People were no longer impressed by success. They were beginning to understand it. The conversation drifted naturally after that, but the balance of the evening had permanently changed. Nobody was hanging on Brandon's words anymore. Every time he spoke, people listened politely. Every time I spoke, they listened carefully. The difference was subtle, yet impossible to miss. I did not enjoy it. I simply noticed it. Attention has its own gravity. Once it shifts, it rarely returns to the same place. One of the guests asked how I first became interested in investing. Another wanted to know what qualities I looked for in people. Someone else asked whether I had ever made mistakes. That question made me laugh. "More than I can count," I said. "Anybody who tells you otherwise is either selling something or hiding something." The table erupted with genuine laughter. Even Linda smiled. For the first time all evening, the atmosphere felt relaxed again. Brandon attempted to join the conversation. "Failure is part of the process," he said. "You have to take risks." "That is true," I replied. "The important part is understanding which risks belong to you and which belong to your ego." Several people nodded immediately. Brandon looked as though he wanted to respond, but thought better of it. I admired that decision. Sometimes wisdom arrives disguised as silence. The birthday candles had long since been blown out. Coffee cups replaced wine glasses. The evening had moved into that comfortable stage where people stop performing and start revealing themselves. Or at least most people do. Linda leaned toward me. "I keep thinking about what Richard said." "About what?" I asked. "About you believing in people before anyone else did." I smiled. "He was being generous." "No," she said softly. "I do not think he was." For a moment, she looked genuinely emotional. Not because of money, not because of success, because she realized there were entire pieces of my life she had never bothered to understand. We had spent decades attending holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings together. Yet she knew surprisingly little about how I spent my time. The realization seemed to trouble her. Across the table, Brandon suddenly cleared his throat. "Can I ask something?" The room grew quiet. "Of course," I said. He hesitated. That alone felt remarkable. Earlier, hesitation had not existed in his vocabulary. "Why did you let everyone think you were retired?" A few guests exchanged glances. I considered the question carefully. "Because I am retired." Confusion crossed his face. "But you still work with companies." "Sometimes." "You still invest." "Yes." "You still advise boards." "Occasionally." He spread his hands. "That does not sound retired." I smiled. "It depends on how you define retirement." Nobody spoke. "Most people think retirement means doing nothing," I continued. "I never understood that idea. To me, retirement means choosing how to spend your time." Several heads nodded around the table. Some people fish. Some people travel. Some people garden. I enjoy helping people build things. The room remained silent for a second before one guest said, "That is probably the best definition of retirement I have ever heard." More agreement followed. Brandon stared at the tablecloth again. I could almost see the memory of his earlier comments replaying inside his head. The jokes, the assumptions, the confidence. Every one of them looked different now. Eventually he looked up and met my eyes. There was no arrogance left in his expression. No smugness. No superiority. Only an uncomfortable awareness that he had misjudged someone completely. And for the first time that evening, I had the feeling he was finally beginning to understand the lesson everyone else had already learned. The most dangerous assumption you can make about another person is believing their entire story can be understood at a glance. For a while, nobody spoke. The conversation seemed to settle into a thoughtful silence. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, just reflective. People were replaying the evening in their minds, connecting details that had not made sense before. I could almost see it happening. The comments, the assumptions, the laughter. Everything looked different now than it had a few hours earlier. Brandon broke the silence first. His voice was quieter than I had heard all evening. "I owe you an apology." Several guests glanced in his direction. He looked directly at me. To his credit, he did not try to smile his way through it. He did not disguise it as a joke. He did not blame anyone else. "I made assumptions," he said. "A lot of them." I nodded but said nothing. He continued, "When I heard you were retired, I created a story in my head about who you were." He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "And I was completely wrong." The room remained silent. Nobody rushed to rescue him. Nobody interrupted. The moment belonged to him. I appreciated that. Genuine apologies require space. "You were not the first person to do that," I said calmly. A few people smiled. Brandon let out a short laugh. "Maybe, but I was probably the loudest." That earned a small ripple of laughter around the table. Even I smiled. There was truth in what he said. Linda leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "I think we all learned something tonight." "Hopefully," I said. One of the guests nodded. "I know I did." Another agreed. "Same here." What interested me most was how different the room felt now compared to the beginning of the evening. Earlier, success had been measured through appearances. Expensive watches, expensive cars, titles, status. Now people seemed interested in character instead. Patience, judgment, perspective. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. Brandon looked toward me again. "Can I ask one last question?" "Of course." "When I made those jokes earlier, why did you not say anything?" Several people immediately looked at me. Apparently they had been wondering the same thing. I considered the answer for a moment. Then I smiled. Because arguing with a wrong assumption usually strengthens it. Nobody spoke. "People rarely change their minds because you defend yourself," I continued. "They change their minds when reality arrives." The silence that followed felt different from all the others that evening. Carried understanding. Brandon slowly nodded. "That makes sense. Besides, I added, lifting my teacup. I have reached an age where proving myself is no longer one of my hobbies. Laughter rolled across the table. Genuine laughter. Warm laughter. The kind that connects people rather than separates them. Even Brandon laughed. The tension that had followed him all evening finally seemed to leave his shoulders. Outside the windows, the harbor lights reflected across the water like scattered stars. Guests began gathering their coats. Chairs moved. Conversations resumed. The evening was drawing to a close. Yet something important had changed. Not my life. Not my investments. Not my future. Those things were exactly the same as they had been when I walked through the door. The difference was that people now saw me clearly. Or at least more clearly than before. And as I watched everyone prepare to leave, I realized something simple. The most satisfying victories are not the ones where you defeat another person. They are the moments when the truth quietly enters the room and does all the work for you. By the time we stepped out of the restaurant, the night air felt cool and clean. A light breeze moved across the harbor, carrying the scent of salt water and distant boats. People lingered near the entrance, continuing conversations that had started around the table. Some exchanged phone numbers. Others hugged goodbye. The evening had begun as a birthday celebration, but it ended as something far more memorable. Linda stood beside me as guests slowly departed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she slipped her arm through mine, something she had not done in years. "I owe you an apology too," she said quietly. I looked at her and smiled. "For what?" She laughed softly. "For not paying attention." The honesty in her voice surprised me. "I spent so much time assuming I knew everything about you that I stopped asking questions." I squeezed her hand gently. "We all do that sometimes." She nodded. "Still, I wish I had known." "You know now," I said. That seemed to comfort her. A few feet away, Brandon stood alone for a moment, watching the last of the guests leave. Then he walked over. His expression was different from the one he had worn when he arrived that evening. Less polished, less certain. Strangely enough, he seemed more genuine. "Evelyn," he said. "Thank you." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" He laughed. "For being nicer about this than I probably deserved." I smiled. "Life usually teaches people what they need to learn." He shook his head. "I think tonight was one of those lessons." "Maybe." He looked toward the harbor. "The strange thing is that I thought I was good at reading people." "Most people think that," I replied. "The problem is that reading people and judging people are not the same skill." He nodded slowly. I could tell he would remember that sentence for a long time. After a few more goodbyes, everyone finally headed toward their cars. I walked to mine alone, carrying the same small purse and wearing the same navy blue dress I had arrived in. Nothing about my appearance had changed. Nothing about my financial situation had changed. Nothing about my future had changed. Yet somehow everything felt different. Not because other people now knew my story, because they had finally stopped inventing one for me. As I settled into the driver's seat, I sat quietly for a moment before starting the engine. The harbor lights reflected in the windshield. Somewhere in the distance, a boat horn echoed across the water. I thought about the laughter from earlier in the evening. I thought about the assumptions, the jokes, the certainty. Then I thought about what had happened afterward. The truth is that I never wanted revenge. I never wanted humiliation. I never wanted anyone to feel small. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted reality to speak for itself. And eventually it did. That is the funny thing about truth. It does not rush. It does not shout. It does not compete for attention. It simply waits. Then, when the moment arrives, it quietly changes everything. I started the car and pulled away from the restaurant. In the rearview mirror, the building grew smaller with every passing second. The evening was over. The lesson remained. Never measure someone's worth by a title. Never confuse retirement with irrelevance. Never mistake silence for weakness. And most importantly, never assume you know someone's story simply because you have only read the cover. Some of the most extraordinary chapters are the ones nobody sees coming.